Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing really well. I hope you're staying safe with your families and your loved ones. Welcome to the next event in our 2020-21 speaker series. This is what democracy looks like. It's with Juston Cooper, who is the Deputy Director of Colorado Criminal Justice Reform Coalition. Our next event in the series is going to feature activist and artist Anthony Grimes, a filmmaker and a founder, one of the founder of Denver Freedom Riders. And Ludo will shortly be able to give you a nudge there in the chat about how you can register for that. I'm sure you know that cultural institutions all over Denver, all over the state, are going through some tough times, to say the least. History Colorado's main funding source, it's dropped more than 50% during this pandemic. And if you're excited by, so I ask you, if you're excited by the lecture series, if you're excited by This Is What the Democracy Looks Like, the Smithsonian exhibition, if it's challenging to you, if you think it's important, ask you to join today as a member or add a donation. And Luda, again, can provide that to you in the chat. I want to take a minute to also read a land acknowledgement that the History Colorado has folks read before events or lectures. And just a word on that, the purpose, if you didn't know, the purpose of a land acknowledgement, it's to recognize, respect, and affirm the ongoing relationship between Indigenous people and the land. And in this case, land acknowledgements also raise awareness about the Indigenous histories, perspectives, and experiences that are often suppressed or forgotten. And since history is this museum's business, that's why you hear a land acknowledgement ahead of events or lectures, and it's why I'm gonna read one to you right now. So in the spirit of healing and education, History Colorado acknowledges the 48 contemporary tribes with historic ties to the state of Colorado. These tribes are History Colorado's partners. History Colorado consults with them when History Colorado plans exhibits, collects, preserves, and interprets artifacts, does archaeological work, and creates educational programs. History Colorado recognizes these Indigenous peoples as the original inhabitants of this land. So a quick word on today's lecturer, Juston Cooper. As I mentioned, Juston is the Deputy Director of the Colorado Criminal Justice Coalition, Reform Coalition. History is happening all the time. It's all we have, really. And we thought that with this lecture series, since questions about democracy here in Denver, on the national scene and abroad are so immediate, that it would be fitting to get people who are contributing to or have a perspective on history that's being made in the moment. Today's topic is on justice and democracy. And you could say that they're two words that folks can fit a lot of ideas into. And a lot of time, those ideas, they can be pretty selective. So Justin's going to give us some idea of what those two words look like, democracy and justice, what they are, not in an abstract way, but what it means in substance for everyday people here in Denver. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Juston Cooper. How are you, Juston?
I'm doing well, Chris. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to History Colorado for putting on this particular event and providing a platform for Coloradians and Denverites to, hear conversation about such important issues and topics that impact our daily lives. I'm excited to be here, so thank you.
I'm super excited to have you, Juston. Really, sincerely, man. Yours has been one I've been looking forward to. What does Ccgrc, Colorado Criminal Justice Reform Coalition, what do they do?
Absolutely, well, and thank you for that question. Our organization, we've been around since 1999, and what we do is we do what is called criminal justice reform. Relatively speaking, we started out back then with a mission to end mass incarceration in the state of Colorado. As many of you may know on the call, over the last couple of decades, the United States overall has been faced with, a justice crisis in our country. And being the country that incarcerates more people than any other country in the world, really elevated to the global limelight over the last couple of decades. And so our organization, started by our founder and executive director, Christy Donner, back in 1999, with the sole mission to end mass incarceration in the state of Colorado through a policy reform and advocacy in reference to the core principle of what we do. More importantly, over the last about decade, we believe that we've kind of chipped away at it in Colorado by helping to close 6 prisons in the state of Colorado, 4 of those being private. We've passed a significant amount of criminal justice reform legislation that's yielded everything from millions of dollars of reinvestment into mental health and substance abuse people for folks on the inside and on the outside, right? Rewriting the entire criminal code in the state of Colorado, a Substance Abuse Control Act in the state of Colorado, really mitigating at getting away from punitive sanctions or punitive notion that people who are dealing with substance abuse and mental health should be criminalized. And so our efforts over the last couple of decades have really been chipping away at ending mass incarceration. And, in 2014, we had a kind of an aha moment. And that was, ending mass incarceration may not happen in our lifetime. It took over several decades to get to where we are as a country in incarcerating more people than in the world. And we thought about how can we have more of a bigger impact? And so we went through about a year of strategic planning on really thinking about what does that impact mean? And we expanded our mission now that states to eliminate the overuse of the criminal justice system and advance community health and safety. We were really intentional about that because we are over criminalizing, over policing, and over incarcerating people in our state and in our country. And so our organization really focuses on how do we eliminate the overuse of the criminal legal system, right, and advance community health and safety. And we do that through running several campaigns. We are perceived as what is called a hybrid organization. A lot of the bulk and core of our work is at the Capitol, doing policy reform and changing laws. But in addition, we run several community-centered driven campaigns that engage community in a way that they can elevate their voice in the conversation called reform. So that is what we do. We are a nonprofit organization, nonpartisan organization. It's statewide, but we're centrally located in Denver. And we're a mighty staff of just 6. And so we run pretty lean, but we run pretty mean.
Now, so how did you get involved with Ccgrc?
Absolutely. Well, I actually came to Ccgrc through some of the juvenile work that I was doing prior to working there. So my career first started off in direct service. I was on the ground working with at-risk youth, gang-involved youth, youth that were involved in the child welfare system, and really started in a direct service capacity and evolved to doing juvenile policy throughout the last, the first 10 years of my career working in juvenile. And, I had an opportunity to meet our current executive director at the Capitol working on some juvenile policy. And at that time, I started to realize there's really more of a kind of what I call an intercept model, kind of like from the beginning to the end of what really propels people into the system and where they end up. That really sparked my interest in looking at what happens on not only the juvenile side, but the adult side. And so I met with the executive director on a couple of occasions, and her and I hit it off right off the bat in reference to both of our visions on what we can do to have an impact on this, and became the deputy director of Ccgrc. I've been the deputy director now for about 6 years. That in addition to my personal lived experience with interacting with the criminal legal system, I've always had a passion from being a person that has been, abused by police, that has been, literally oppressed by the criminal legal system myself. It was an innate passion of mine to want to get into the field, and I had the blessing and the opportunity to work with Ccgrc at the policy level.
What does that term mean, criminal? And I think like democracy and justice, they can be very flexible. What does that term mean, criminal justice reform?
I tell you, Chris, it's a very fluid term now, right? Given the current climate and what's happened over the last decade. In theory, the term criminal justice reform literally alludes to the opportunity to reform or reconfigure the criminal legal system as it relates to public safety, right? But there's been, national debates about the word reform from the advocacy community, activist community, and the criminal legal system community over the last decade plus, given the evolution of what's happened in the quote unquote reform. What I mean by that is, there's debate in a school of thought that says reform is just reinventing the same thing, right? Repackaging the same product. Reform could be linked or correlated to systems improvement. And there's another school of thought that says reform should mean dismantle, right? Not necessarily recreate the same thing, but dismantle it and create something new. And so there's two schools of thoughts around what criminal justice reform means. But collectively, I would say the universal understanding is that basically repairing or reconfiguring or changing how the criminal legal system operates in its current state, because it has failed us in our state and as a country for multiple decades.
So from your perspective, the work that you've been doing this time, how does that inform your definition of democracy?
Absolutely. It informs my definition of democracy because of engagement, right? The cliche definition of democracy is a government ran by the people and for the people, right? But my work in reference to looking at criminal justice reform is solely, at a core of it is elevating the voices of those who have been directly impacted by the criminal legal system to engage not only in reform, but engage in our democracy. So there's like a direct correlation in reference to our work at Ccgrc and how we think about engagement and what democracy means for us as a country and as a state. Because without the inclusivity, the equity of all voices being engaged in how our government operates and the impact that our government has on us as citizens, then our democracy is at threat, right? We're literally at a crisis of looking at what can happen to our democracy if we don't have a collective and equitable voice engaged in that. And so our work is predicated on elevating the voices of those who have been directly impacted by the system, oppressed by the system, and engaging in conversations around democracy and how our government serves its people.
A month or two back, when we were talking about the conversation that we're going to have, you've mentioned it's a term or it's a phrase that you've used a number of times, and I wanted to get into that. You said one of the first things that you wanted to address was the climate we're in. Can you explain that idea a little bit more to folks who might be watching and listening, the climate we're in? What does that mean?
Absolutely. Well, I think that, many of us on this particular call or event are experiencing the devastation of COVID and the climate that we're in reference to our public health crisis, right? In addition, we have seen, definitely post George Floyd across the country and more importantly, across the world, civil unrest around racial reckoning in not only our country, but the perspective of the globe around how our country historically has oppressed people of color, right? And the different mechanisms in which that has been done. So I think we are currently in a climate that is demanding a new interest around how our democracy is serving people from a public health standpoint, to a justice standpoint, right, to an education standpoint that I didn't throw in there, mental health and substance abuse health, behavioral health. These are all buckets of crises that our current climate is elevating, right, or putting a magnifying glass on to really gauge what is our public interest in these issues that's impacting us. So I think climate matters. And to the point of justice and democracy, we are at a critical crossroads around this climate redefining what justice means. We're seeing that through the police accountability movement or defund police movement. We're seeing that in the prosecutorial reform around DAs. We're seeing that in the carceral reform around how our system is currently, our system of public safety is engaging our community and redefining what do we mean by public safety and who truly represents that. So that's at the direct forefront, a confrontation of what we mean now as a community in this climate, or as a public in this climate around what does justice mean and how does the climate influencing that conversation that we're having as a general public.
That's a great answer. From your position at CCJRC, the work that you're doing, climate we're in, what developments are you seeing in the Colorado criminal legal system that are potential threats to democracy?
Well, I think first and foremost, we're seeing that the criminal legal system is being confronted, literally, in how it serves the community. And I think our criminal legal system, and I want to be really intentional in sharing with the audience that I'm very intentional about saying criminal legal system and not criminal justice system, right? Because from decades upon decades, the outcomes of the criminal justice system have literally illuminated that there is not actual justice that's being served, right? Not in a comprehensive, equitable way. And so I think that that in itself is constituting a threat to our democracy because A, this legal system in its current format is disenfranchising citizens every day from engaging into all the things that make us viable citizens, right? Paying taxes, working, engaging in our community, engaging in local government issues. If folks are disenfranchised through incarceration, through having criminal backgrounds, then it's a threat to our democracy because we're not having full participation. The second threat to the democracy I'm seeing is the concept behind punishment versus rehabilitation, right? Our democracy promotes rehabilitation in a way that we have a healthy, vibrant community and citizens who are engaging in everyday our economy, our education system. And so when you don't have a narrative around rehabilitation, right, and you have more of a narrative around punishment, then it's disenfranchising a population from engaging into democracy. And that's a threat to the quality of our democracy because it's a threat to the quality of life of our citizens engaging in democracy. Last but not least, I would say currently the status of the criminal legal system and the threat to our democracy and how we engage, whether it's civically, whether it's economics, whether it's education, is the idea that the interest is starting to shift in reference to the role of the criminal legal system regarding our democracy, right? The criminal legal system was predicated on law and order and putting in or institutionalizing a system that helps promote safety to where we have a viable democracy to operate in. Democracy meaning government, right? Mm-hmm. Relatively speaking. And that interest is starting to shift in what the expectations of this public safety narrative. I think that it's being confronted with an antiquated perspective on safety served by the criminal legal system versus modern day times and where we're at. That in itself is a huge threat to our democracy because it threatens the infrastructure of how people feel safe, how people feel heard, how people feel healthy in a democracy in order to engage. So there's some nexus there, in my humble opinion, of how it's threatening democracy. But I think that it opens up a door for a very interesting dialogue about the correlation of our public safety system and our democracy as it operates now.
What about opportunities to broaden democracy?
Yeah, I think there are, especially in the current climate, right? There's definitely an opportunity to broaden our democracy, and not to be redundant or cliche, but the equitable part of equity that we're faced with right now with the racial reckoning, right? The disenfranchisement conversation that we're having right now, all of those things, if mitigated and overhauled, increase the opportunity to expand democracy because you have more participation. And in addition, you have an equitable participation where all citizens, regardless of race, color, creed, and nationality, are actually truly engaging in what we perceive our democracy to be, right? So there's an opportunity there to expand how we perceive our democracy. I think the racial reckoning piece is vitally important. Also, not only serving as a threat, but serving as an opportunity, right? Because I think that it gives us an opportunity as a democracy to reconcile the historical harm. It is a stain on our consciousness as a country in reference to the historical narrative around race relations. And we have yet to collectively, as a country, really address it in a substantive way that really reconciles the harm and repairs the harm. You know, one of the things that we've heard as it relates to expanding our democracy, especially economically, is around the conversation of reparations. What does that mean for indigenous people to the country that are people of color? And it's been a controversial topic for years. But more importantly, what raises it to the democracy level is that it has implications around repairing harm, around investment. You know, we've seen it through the Marshall Plan, right, after World War II, right? So there's opportunities to expand democracy in thinking about what is fair and what's equitable, and really re-enfranchise or including all citizens, regardless of some of the things that have occurred under this criminal legal system disguised as oppression.
How's COVID, pardon me, how's COVID, as I cough, how's COVID affected issues that that you work on in the criminal legal system in Colorado?
It's had a significant impact. You know, we've seen when COVID first hit here in Colorado back in early March, right, our state government having to respond to it, not only from a public health standpoint, but also from a criminal legal standpoint, right? Ensuring the health and safety of folks who are incarcerated as it relates to the danger of COVID was an immediate priority for our criminal legal system. I'll give you an example. Our Colorado Department of Corrections, that where folks who are incarcerated in prison had to respond to all the mandates coming down from CDPHE, the Center for Disease Control, about social distancing, PPE, all of those things had to be incorporated. Well, when you have prisons that are overcrowded, right, you have to immediately respond to that. So initially, our governor at the time issued an executive order to really look at how to decrease the prison population for folks who, A, have served their time, folks who are low risk, or people who are at high risk of receiving COVID, the elderly population, folks who have existing conditions in incarceration in prison, right? So that immediately was an adequate response where our governor worked with the head of Department of Corrections to respond to COVID. Well, in early, I want to say June of this year, maybe even around July, that was an executive order that was pushed out by our governor. That executive order was not extended. So now you have an outbreak currently happening in real time in the second wave of COVID in our prison systems right now, putting folks inside at risk of death, at risk of illness, at risk. So the COVID has had a direct impact on the criminal legal system from the incarceration standpoint. It's had a direct impact on the jail system. In Colorado, we have 52 county jails. Jails are ran by the county in our state, not by the state. All of those jails had to have an adequate response as well when you have people inside who are incarcerated for long periods of time that are stacked upon each other. So the jails had to respond. And what we saw was a 30% decrease in the jail population across the board. Well, here's the subsequent impact, Chris, to what this really drew attention to and elevated. For the last 30 plus years, the reform community has been pushing opportunities around reform, decarceration, reducing the population, right? Really implementing programs in community that can serve folks who are dealing with mental health and substance abuse issues coming out of the system. Reentry services that are adequately prepared and responded by the community. All of the things that the criminal legal system said that they could not do, that they pushed back, that they defended, they doubled down and was not in agreement with this reform ideology or reform movement. And then COVID hits and they're doing the very things that they said they could not do. So COVID has had a direct impact. And I don't want to frame it because, COVID is very sensitive and it is a real threat. But in a language of kind of pros and cons, what it has done is inadvertently illuminated the very things that the system has been saying that they could not do, and now they've done. And what we're witnessing is a slow repeal of that, a slow backpedal of that, which then puts into question, what is the priority of our criminal legal system? Are they going to be bound to antiquated ways of being and roll back to that status quo? Or are they going to be innovative and continue to move forward and capitalize on the opportunity for reform, really influenced by COVID?
Are you hopeful? Are you hopeful around that?
I'm cautiously optimistic. I am hopeful. I think that it depends on leadership, right? We've seen this election year across the country, the turmoil around the leadership change, but that also trickles down statewide, right? And so I'm cautiously optimistic that we can really, as a state, as Colorado, be on the right side of this, right? And continue to really promote a public health and safety system that really actually works, right? But I'm cautiously optimistic because there is a school of thought that is wedded to the old way of being and believes that that system works, right? And when you look at the concept of the system working, you know, long time ago, Chris, I had a small stint in IT, right? In information technologies. And most, you know, tech people will tell you, you build a system to produce an output. And if it produces that output, it's working. Well, the ingenuity, the impetus of the system to produce the output that it has is actually working. It was designed to oppress. It was designed to incarcerate. It was intentionally targeted towards people of color. Like, it was designed as a control mechanism. And that has technically worked. But I think that I'm cautiously optimistic because what the trade-off has been is not only the harm and damage to the community, but trillions of dollars spent on a system that people are still concerned with their safety. It has not mitigated how people perceive feeling safe. And specifically in Colorado, I'll give an example here. In Colorado, currently right now, we're spending close to over $1 billion in our prison system. That's not including our jail system. That's not including our state supervision system of parole and probation. It's not even including local law enforcement. That's at the local county level. We're spending close to over $1 billion. Yet, does the public really feel safer? Yet, the myth is that crime drives prisons admissions and drives prison costs. That's actually not true. There is no research, no body of research that draws a correlation to an increase in crime and an increase in prison budgets and population. Not at all. So here we are faced with a smoke and mirrors dilemma to say, well, we are spending all of this money, taxpayer dollars. The folks on this call, these are your dollars being spent towards a system that actually is not promoting true public health and safety in a comprehensive way. I myself, in our organization, we're not prison abolitionists. We do believe that there is a role for a criminal legal system. Absolutely. We do believe that there is a role for an carceral system. Absolutely. The question is, what is that role? How do we right-size that? And it should really it should be a downsized role and not the dominant response to the social issues that we face here in Colorado today.
Fabulous. What other local background issues that folks might not be aware of are happening that are affecting changes to Colorado's criminal legal system?
Well, there's a lot. One of the local issues that's happening right now is around criminal records, right? It's called Collateral Consequences. When a person is trajected into the criminal legal system, they, of course, acquire a criminal background. Often criminal backgrounds can serve as barriers to accessing housing, to accessing jobs, to accessing post-secondary education, to accessing business loans. And so when we look at our current climate in reference to small businesses being impacted by COVID, right, there's a barrier to a subpopulation that doesn't even have access to that capital because they have a criminal record. That's happening in real time. Right now, COVID is impacting people in a way that they're losing jobs and losing housings. But there's a subpopulation out there that can't even get access to housing during this pandemic because of a criminal record. That's happening in real time right now, right? We look at what's happening with our economy and the downturn of our economy because of COVID, right? Primarily right now because of COVID. And we're looking at unemployment being at its highest rates. Well, again, there's a subpopulation out there that can't get access to employment because they have a criminal record, in addition to dealing with COVID, right? So there's a direct impact happening in communities right now predicated on our criminal legal systems' desire and design to build these criminal records in which there could be alternatives to helping mitigate a person having any criminal record involvement, whether they're low risk offenders or low level crimes that are occurred, petty crimes like a municipal level. I mean, folks can develop a criminal record through getting traffic tickets, right? So these things have a direct daily impact. That's one of the key issues that's happening right now. A second key issue that's happening right now with the criminal legal system, as we're probably all aware of, right? We're seeing this across the country, is the conversation around police accountability, right? And there's a police defund movement that's happening in real time that's also occurring in Colorado right now, predicated on, police abuse, specifically of people of color, right? So that's happening in our backyard. And there's a somewhat of a divide in multiple communities, specifically Denver in the metro area, around what does that mean? What does defund police mean? What does the police accountability mean? How do we stop, police violence on Black and brown people, right? So that's happening right now in real time, that the criminal legal system is having an impact on Colorado in the Denver metro area around key issues that people care about: housing, jobs, policing, right, in our communities. More so, last but not least, we just went through an election cycle where Colorado elected DAs in all 22 judicial districts. So Colorado has 22 judicial districts. Each judicial district elects their DA. Not a lot of people in the state know that DAs are elected, but DAs are the gatekeepers to mass incarceration. Their power, they have literally almost full immunity in how they exercise prosecution and their power. And that's having a direct impact on our criminal legal system, criminal justice reform in the state of Colorado, because DAs also are not just important and impactful in a courtroom, but they're important and impactful outside of the courtroom. They influence policy. So if there is policy that's being proposed around healthcare reform to really mitigate COVID that impacts justice-involved people, the DA's voice in that policy is extremely, extremely valuable. And depending on their position, whether they're for or against, impacts our daily lives every day. And with the special legislation session coming up, most people not knowing that DAs are elected and DAs have decision-making at the power, that's right in our backyard right now, and it's a key issue that we're facing as Coloradians. So those are the things I would outline to say that are currently are the current issues right here in our backyard right now, along with, a lot of the things that we're concerned about, right? A robust public health care system. Who has access, who doesn't? The fact that this new administration is going to have to wrestle with the Affordable Care Act, what people call Obamacare, being reviewed currently right now by the Supreme Court. Well, Colorado is an ACA state. And for the first time, it was a game changer for justice-involved people in the system, because for the first time they had access to health care. Well, if ACA is repealed, what does that mean for folks who are in the justice system getting access to health care? So these are real issues in real time, Chris.
That's and you made I want to, because you've done a great job of kind of giving that that universal to the local, but also to different policy silos. And I want to jump into that real quick. What ways do you see the criminal legal system and issues of democracy connecting to other fundamentally democratic issues like healthcare, the economy, housing, and education? And you can speak broadly, or you can speak locally.
Well, I think that there's a direct correlation, and that direct correlation is cost. I'll give an example. As we continue to fund the criminal legal system at the rate that the state does, the trade-off is each year we defund higher education. So most people don't know that the general fund on average decreases 5% each year, taken away from post-secondary education. And our priorities have been increasing the criminal legal system, more importantly, the Department of Corrections budget, right, each year. So our state leaders make decisions that with our taxpayer dollars. And the trade-off is what we saw pre-COVID happening over the last couple of years, specifically in Colorado and locally speaking, is that institutions, public institutions and universities increasing tuition, right? And some even privatizing because they're no longer receiving funding from the general fund of the state. Well, that's a direct impact. And I often say to people, even if you have zero experience with the criminal legal system, never engaged, never had a problem, it directly impacts you too. Because as these budgets metastasize, there's a trade-off where other budgets are not getting funded, right? There's not adequate funding for ending homelessness, like at a local level or state level. There's not adequate, these are budget balancing conversations that our state has to prioritize. So you have a direct impact there where criminal legal system decisions impact our education system, impact our housing infrastructure, right? Impact our public health. So for example, right, our organization led by my policy director, Terry Hurst, for the last 4+ years, we run a campaign called Take Care Health Matters. And it's been a statewide public education campaign on access to healthcare for justice-involved people. How that's directly relevant, Chris, to your question, is she has organized over the last 4 years public health institutions in our state and criminal legal institutions in our state to bring them together to help them understand the intersectionality, right? Those are imperative conversations because one operates autonomous from the other, yet anytime our hospitals are consumed with folks dealing with mental health and substance abuse services, or our jails are serving as the #1 de facto service provider of mental health services, that's a problem. The conversation should be, this is a public health crisis, not a criminal legal system crisis, but the criminal legal system has been the dominant responder, the first responder. So there's a trade-off again around how the legal system, if it doesn't adopt or adapt to change and reform, and you'll hear local officers from police districts, you'll hear jails, you'll even hear prison systems, actors saying, we don't want to be in the game of mental health. We don't want to be the first responders to this. It's not our wheelhouse, yet they are. Because right now we haven't invested in a public health system that's robust enough to provide treatment on demand for folks at a local or state level, right? Residential treatment, right? So that's the trade-off conversation and how the criminal legal system impacts all of the areas like education, public health, and economics.
I want to go ahead and open it up. Thank you, Juston.
Sweet. Yeah. Hey, thank you so much. I love the conversation, Chris. I always love chatting with you, brother.
This is like, it's like a master class. We all get diplomas after this. Let's go ahead and open it up to some questions. This is from Barb. Is there any current effort to address the bail system? As I am aware, there are district attorneys and judges who believe the current system is not working.
Barb, thank you for that question. And to answer your direct question, yes, there is. One of the key organizations that's been doing there's two really prominent organizations that have been doing bail reform in the state for a couple of years now. And that's the ACLU of Colorado, and also the organization that was formerly called the Colorado Criminal Defense Institute, ran by Maureen Kane. Those are the two prominent organizations that have really been pushing on bail reform that I think actually has caught a lot of headwind over the last couple of years, right? Because what we have found is that our bail system has been completely inadequate, right? And often the example of that is if you're too poor to bond out, you can't get out. Like, so you have, a sitting population pre-COVID when you have jails that close to 60% of their entire population are pretrial detainees, people who have not been convicted of anything, but yet are too poor to bond out, leads to overcrowding of our jails, right? Which costs the taxpayers money every day. When people are sitting in jail and prison, we're paying for that. We're footing that bill. So these two organizations have been pushing extensively over the last couple of years around reforming our entire bail system. And what we have observed, again, to your earlier question, Chris, Barb, is that, again, the system have an opportunity to be on the right side of this. There is some headwind with a lot of DAs, candidates who just ran for DA, and system actors saying, yeah, you know what, this doesn't really work. It hasn't been working, and we need to revisit about how we can reform the bail system. So I think there's a common ground happening in our state right now around the issue of bail that is really promising.
You've touched on throughout our conversation different aspects of criminal legal system. Tell me a little bit about the Transforming Safety Project.
Yes. Ccgrc, we launched a campaign back in 2017 called Transforming Safety. And this particular campaign was predicated on our theory or school of thought that inserts that if we significantly invest in community and really help build the infrastructure for community to be a viable structure or institute to serve people and mitigate public health and safety issues, then we then get to a real conversation of right-sizing what the role of the criminal legal system. So our organization, through what we call community reinvestment, as a strategy where we do policy reforms at the Capitol, criminal justice policy reform, that creates cost savings in reference to funding, and that funding gets reallocated back into community for crime prevention, and multiple services that are public safety and health strategies. And so we had selected two particular communities back in 2017, North Aurora and Southeast Colorado Springs, as demonstration projects for transforming safety. There were two tracks. One was a grant program that goes to organizations, after school programs, that all of these priorities that these communities set, because it is community centered and it is community driven, where they select their priorities around public safety that they want investment in to try to tackle. The second track was an entrepreneurial track. And that track is where, for the first time, I think, across the country, but in Colorado, we brought the private sector lending, small lending, micro lending organizations called CDFIs, right? Community Development Financial Institutes that are federally mandated to fund in low-income communities, to the table to say, how do we create an entrepreneurial track to help mitigate people who are dealing with the collateral consequences and barriers of creating their own business because of a criminal background, or because they live in poverty, or because of a lack of certain education or access to education, and really help to look at getting them capital to really bring themselves up out of those statuses. So those were the two track of the Transforming Safety Initiative that's currently operating in North Aurora and Southeast Colorado Springs. It is up for what is called Sunset Review in 2023, where the legislator will come back and say, hey, did this work, right? And so that's our Transforming Safety, but it was really predicated on two things: community reinvestment. Once if you give community the resources, they can actually promote public health and safety. And how do we really look at building an infrastructure around that's driven by communities to deal with the issues that community is faced with, as far as crime and mass incarceration?
Here's a, thank you, Juston. Here's a question from Julie. What other states that you and your organization, are there other states that you and your organization look to as models for criminal legal system reform?
Oh, absolutely, all the time. Ccgrc being Colorado based, we've worked on national platforms for a long time, right? And so there are other states. There's incredible work that came out of California, where forgive me on that time frame, I want to say probably back 2013, 14, don't correct me on that, quote me on that, where California, when they were propositioned with passing a ballot measure called Prop 46, that really was predicated on the state the feds suing the state around prison overpopulation and them having to downsize. Through that effort was reinvestment of those cost savings of downsizing the prison population, in theory, back to community. Well, from that, there was an organization that really initiated what is called a crime survivors campaign, really calling for alternatives to folks who are victims of crime and elevating their voice and what they wanted to see. That's an example of Ccgrc. We launched our own crime survivors campaign, kind of predicated off of looking at those models, both in California and Oregon. And what that campaign really focuses on is the narrative that DAs own the space of serving victims, which is not true, because it's inequitable and they don't serve all victims at all, right? So that's an example, but we do look to other states like Oregon, like California, some of our allies on the East Coast and down South. There's an organization called the National Council for Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls that have collected multiple chapters across the country, really elevating the voices of women who have been incarcerated, who are doing phenomenal work around reform. They have a thing called participatory budgeting, where they look at local and state budgets and look for opportunities to reinvest funding back in the community. So we do rely on other states and allies across the country that are doing wonderful work and have done this work longer than us. We've built relationships for sure.
This is a question from Peggy.
Mm-hmm.
Is Ccgrc involved at all with expungement efforts beyond the governor's ability to expunge pot charges?
Great question. So expungement and expunging pot charges, are we involved in expungement efforts? We are not directly involved in expungement. We've done some work in the past on expungement legislation, but we don't have a direct hand in expungement now. However, we do partner with organizations that have an exclusive focus on expungement and record sealing. And so I want to distinguish for the audience the difference, right? Expungement actually happens at a juvenile level. So when you hear the language expungement, we're talking about a certain age group that their records get sealed. When you get into the adult population, you get into what is called record sealing, right? Which is a slightly variation based upon age in the system. The governor's authority is more so around clemency and pardons. So that's different from expungement. The governor has the authority, the executive authority, to do what is called clemency, which is really looking at a resentencing of a person's sentence based upon, if it's drug related, or what is called pardon, where they can actually pardon a previous record that a person may have that's around drug offenses. Contrary to popular belief, Colorado has always been relatively liberal with our marijuana laws, right? We have, our state does not have a lot of folks incarcerated in prison or jail behind marijuana possession. Our state historically has been exclusively focused on distribution. So, we don't do marijuana policy, but as it relates to expungement and record sealing, we've had a hand in it over the years, but it's not work that we're currently doing.
This is from Jackson. I'm wondering what Juston thinks about the recent law passed in Oregon that decriminalizes amounts of many different currently scheduled drugs, and scheduled the ranking under federal law. Would this be a measure you would support in Colorado? And if so, what do you think those measures should look like?
Great question. So we actually have passed legislation, decriminal legislation already in Colorado, right, around scheduled drugs in Colorado. So it is work that we directly do now. In fact, last year we passed legislation that really looked at low-level drug possession based upon the schedule, decriminalizing that from a felony conviction to a misdemeanor conviction. That actually went into law into effect in March of this year, right when COVID hit, right? So we do drug policy reform. We do support decriminalization strategies around drug policy. There is a distinction, again, two schools of thoughts across the country around drug policy reform. One is the legalization of drugs, and the other is decriminalization of drugs. Those are actually two separate things. So as far as the efforts in Oregon, their decriminalized efforts, it is something that we would support and do support. We do believe in a harm reduction model as far as drug possession versus distribution, right? It's important that we identify that folks who are suffering from drug abuse or addiction are not criminalized, but yet receive the public health response that they deserve. And so we do support the Oregon efforts, and we have passed and are working on current legislation right now in real time today in Colorado.
This one is from David and Pam. I think there was a report this week that for the first time, Philadelphia sent mental health professionals to handle an issue without including the police. Can you discuss how this could work in Colorado?
Great question, because it's actually currently happening in Colorado. It's called a co-responder model. There are several examples, including one that's specific in Denver called the HEAT program, where you have a co-responder model of a mental health clinician or a health professional that actually is dispatched with an officer in reference to responding to an issue or crisis. We wholeheartedly support and endorse these types of models because, again, the opportunity to pivot an alternative criminal or a dominant criminal legal response to a public health issue is paramount in reference to really repairing the harm and really helping people who are dealing with substance abuse and mental health. So there are several initiatives like that across the state of Colorado that are happening right now in real time. It was exciting to hear that Philadelphia has done that. Texas is another state that's really moving towards that direction. We've seen some of that in California. It's an expanded concept and model across the nation right now that not only are advocates and advocacy groups looking at, but also law enforcement and the criminal legal system is adopting as well. One of the big things that you'll hear from actors in the criminal legal system, like DAs, like cops, is they talk about diversion, right? How do you prevent folks from going further into the criminal legal system? And so they are proponents of co-responder models. They are proponents of alternatives like pre-booking diversion. There's an initiative called LEAD, Law Enforcement Assistant Diversion, that really looks at low-level petty offense that are dealing with folks municipal level, everything from public intoxication or urination in parks or anything like that actually have a co-responsive model where they actually send someone out that has a clinical background that helps mitigate these issues. That's supposed to be diversion, meaning that they get an opportunity to get referred to health services pre-booking. So there are models that are currently active in Colorado right now. It's a TBD on the efficacy of it, but we are huge supporters and proponents of co-responder models.
In the last couple of minutes, I want to give folks an opportunity to ask any more questions. But I want to ask you, Juston, is there anything that Ccgrc is working on right now that you'd like folks to know about?
Yes, I think first and foremost, we're recently working on a campaign called DA Know Your DA and DA Accountability. We really want folks to educate themselves on the role, responsibility of district attorneys. It's vitally important as you think about public health and safety and how our criminal legal system operates. Again, because they are the most powerful actor in the criminal legal system, who have almost zero to no accountability by any other infrastructure at all. And so their performance is important for the community to know, because it's our taxpayer dollars that pay for their jobs, right? We elect them into office, yet most people have no idea of the role and power and responsibility of the elected DAs and their influence on the criminal legal system and policy. So definitely go to our website to check out more information on that. We're currently working on that. Again, we have a campaign called Take Care, Health Matters that's focusing on the intersectionality of justice involved people and access to healthcare. I highly encourage people to follow that campaign, especially, during the COVID crisis. If you have loved ones or family members that have been involved in the past in the justice system or currently involved, this is a campaign that can really help educate you and your family on how these folks get access to healthcare. We're currently working on that. We're in the process of really looking at the uptick in violence that's happening, especially with young people, right? And Colorado over the years have had, at a local level, at the Denver local level, have had several initiatives over the years to try to really mitigate youth violence in our community. We're not, launched into that yet, but we're exploring how we can play a role in supporting that. We have an ongoing civic engagement campaign that helps people who are justice involved know their rights to vote, right? So to the point of democracy, Colorado has never practiced permanent disenfranchisement. There's a urban and suburban myth out there, you guys, that if you have a criminal background or if you have a felony, you can't vote in our state. It is not true at all. Right. And so over the last couple of years, we've expanded this campaign to really educate the community on what their rights are with a criminal record to vote. Bottom line, criminal background does not matter. If a person is not in the system, they can vote in our state and in our democracy. They can engage. The only folks who right now currently who cannot vote are people who are serving a felony conviction in prison or in jail. And so we have worked on legislation last year that for the first time restored the rights of people on parole to be able to vote. That's approximately over 10,000 people who currently can vote. Right now, there's approximately around 85,000 people on probation in our state, under state supervision. All of them are eligible to register to vote and vote. And so that's another campaign that we're working on right now that we highly encourage people to follow, get engaged in, spread the word, along with some other policy stuff that's in development of what we're looking at doing this year at the Capitol. So,
Juston, thank you so much.
Gosh, hey, Chris, man,
I don't know if we
talking to you, brother.
I don't know if we need any other lectures now. I think you've set a very high bar.
And I know, for folks out there, the police accountability is absolutely popped up. It's all across the nation. It's on our TVs everywhere, and it is a real issue. I think that what we're seeing, ladies and gentlemen, is our public interest on policing is changing, is shifting. It's a multicultural issue. It's a multi-race issue. And so I think that has really elevated the profile of how we do policing in our country and in our state. And I encourage people to follow that. Our organization is not directly involved in police accountability work, but again, there's an intersectionality to all of this, Chris. And so I know that's a hot topic for people, folks who haven't been tracking these things, with the George Floyd stuff has probably now are, because it's all over the news, right? We can't get away from it. We've seen the protest that's happening in Aurora, in Denver, and the things that are really pushing this climate to say there's a reckoning that we have to have as a state, as a city. And that reconciliation is going to be important in reference to us moving forward on what I will leave you with, which is our interest in what our public health and safety means. And I'm very intentional. Usually when people say public safety, we say that it's synonymous with the 3 C's, cops, courts, and cages. but we all know that there's multiple strategies that actually keep communities safe, like education, jobs, housing, all the basic human needs. And so I encourage folks to think about public safety from a lens of public health and safety, because inserting that one word changes the narrative on how we perceive public health and safety in our communities. So thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you, sir. Absolutely fantastic.
Anytime.
Justin, we'll see you again at 7.
Yep. Okay.
And folks, thank you so much for the great questions. Thank you to Luda and Kelsey. And if you haven't joined as a member, please do make a donation. Check out Ccgrc. I'm sure they could. If I can go to bat for them, they could probably use some help too. I know this face isn't gonna. This isn't gonna. I'm not gonna. I can. Yeah. I'm not gonna get you that many donations. But yeah. But check them out. Ccgrc. It's believe ccgrc.org.
Yes.
And find out more about the work that they're doing. Next talk is Anthony Grimes. That's January 13th. We'll see you. Have a great holiday. Thank you. Thank you again, Justin.